Hi, so this is the first chapter ever of Startup Series by Glilot Capital, where we go to the portfolio companies' offices and we talk to them a bit about their product and their point of view. And here I'm at Upstream's offices with Dan. Can you tell us a bit about Upstream?
Sure. So Upstream Security is a cybersecurity company focused around securing mobility services. So we basically cater to two types of companies, OEMs, which are car manufacturers, and various types of mobility providers, which are fleets, car sharing and car rental companies, trucking fleets, and companies of that nature. The company is headquartered in Israel. Our co-founders, Yonatan Appel and Yoav Levy, are ex-Checkpoint and Perva, Juniper employees, so a lot of cyber background in our DNA. We built a platform that is somewhat unique. It's a cloud-based approach to securing connected vehicles. So we basically developed a data platform that uses data that is manufactured and produced by the car companies or by the fleets, and uses that data to create a baseline of normal activity, understanding how these vehicles operate on a normal day. And then we use that knowledge, that understanding to understand what are anomalies and outliers in behaviors, and then alert on them in real time. So essentially, it's a platform that is plug and play and can actually insert and help these connected vehicles really secure and make sure that the vehicles and everything around them is secure, and thus ensure that they're also safe and that they don't impact the drivers or the passengers alike.
What's so unique about the automotive industry? I mean, we usually invest in companies who work with various industries, like, for example, Insights, who are doing threat intelligence, or Polyrise, who are doing access management for the cloud. Why do you think the automotive industry requires a unique, a domain-specific solution in the cybersecurity space?
So I think, like, from just a market perspective, this industry is pretty different than many of the standard IT spaces. So first dynamic that you have in this area is that there's a fairly small number of manufacturers that are known as OEMs in this space, and they basically produce tens of millions of new vehicles each year. And that's, I think, very different than like a traditional IT, where you have hundreds of thousands of enterprises that you can sell to as a vendor. So that's like one big difference. The second is that there is a relationship here that you have between the makers of the cars, like the OEMs, the BMW, GM, Fords of the world, and their suppliers. So every new vehicle has tens of thousands of components that are made by third parties, companies like Bosch and Continental and Delphi, that actually produce the seat belts, the ECUs, the components inside your vehicle. So that creates a dynamic in terms of, like, the complexity of the endpoints that you have to protect. Then the last point is these are the endpoints in this case are numerous. So you take even a small car manufacturer, they typically produce several millions of vehicles every year, and that compounds over time because you have connected vehicles. A vehicle stays on the road for over 10 years these days. So you within 10 years you can have hundreds of millions of vehicles just by one car manufacturers, and that means that if there's an attack and if there's like a common vulnerability, the spread, the impact that it creates is just massive, something that you typically do not see on the traditional IT side.
So if I would like to ask you, what does the CISO in an OEM organization is worried about? What keeps him up at night? What would you say? What are the biggest threats today?
So I think it's twofold. On the IT, CISOs in OEMs are typically responsible both on the IT as well as on the connected car infrastructure. So on the IT, they inherit all the same fears and risks that their counterparts in banks and traditional enterprise inherit. There's no difference to that. The risks are pretty much the same. But then they have something which you could say is potentially bigger, which is how to take care of security on cars that are becoming more and more connected. Like 10 years ago, most of the vehicles on our roads were not connected. Didn't have any internet connectivity. This year, in 2020, all three North American OEMs are going to sell only 100% connected vehicles. And that means that there is inherent risk with each one of these vehicles, and they have to think about how do I make sure that the safety of these vehicles and the passengers is ensured, and if the car is not secured, you cannot ensure their safety. And I think that's their number one fear. I think there is a big realization that in order to secure it, you can't just focus on the vehicle itself. You have to look at the periphery, at all the applications that connect to it, and that's not a trivial undertaking that they have to make.
Interesting. So speaking of threats, congrats on the latest report about cybersecurity threats that you've just published. I've read the term that you've mentioned in the report that says supply chain vulnerabilities. Now, I'm familiar with the term supply chain attacks. How is it different?
So typically car makers procure, as I said earlier, components from what's called a tier one. Companies like Bosch and Continental and Delphi and Aptiv. And then inside these components, you typically have tier twos and tier threes, and you have software libraries that are not in the direct control of the actual brand, the car maker that sells the end product, the vehicle. If there is a vulnerability in one of these components, so say a TCU or an ECU that's inside of the vehicle, there's a low probability that it also exists in other cars that have the same component, not necessarily by the same OEM. So you can have a TCU that's used by Ford, it's also used by Nissan. That's something that's very prevalent in this space, and it means that if there is a vulnerability, you could have hundreds of thousands of vehicles that are impacted by it. And then there's, I think, the other challenge in this space, which is very different from IT. How do you patch? How do you do remediation activities? In IT, there is some vulnerability in Windows. There's Patch Tuesday, and you can push it across the world, not with a click of a button, but not that much different. And then in cars, how do you create that infrastructure of really updating software? Maybe in some cases you have to bring it to the garage. Not a very trivial undertaking, and that's like one of the things that CISOs in this space are very concerned about.
Interesting. Okay, now I have this question, which I obviously know the answer to, okay? So we were interested in investing in a cybersecurity company in this space because we too think there is a need in a domain-specific solution. However, we've seen a lot of companies. At the end of the day, we obviously decided to invest in Upstream Security. How are you different from other players in the space?
So I think we basically, there's no one solution that solves the entire problem in security, that neither in the IT side nor in the mobility side. I think what makes us unique is that we took an approach which is very holistic. It looks at, instead of going inside the vehicle, we understood that there is a lot of data that's already being collected by and produced by the car manufacturers and by the fleets. And what we were able to do is essentially make use of this data, repurpose it, and essentially use it as a mechanism to find anomalies in real time, detect vulnerabilities that exist either in the vehicles or in the overarching architecture, and do that all with a data platform rather than with a hardware product or a software product. This is a cloud-based solution that essentially resides within the cloud of our customer, of the OEM or the fleet that uses us. And that's, I think we were the first to take this approach, and to this day we're the leading platform that is able to do that.
And it's a game changer probably because it really shortened the time to sell and the time to implement and many more.
Yeah, it's the only solution that we're aware of that can actually have immediate impact. As long as you have data, and today there is no OEM that does not have data, as long as you have data, we can have effective security right now, even retroactively. So even if you give us data that is a year or 2 years old, we're able to use it and tell you whether you may have been breached in the past, and we're effective right within like a week to 2 weeks time, which is the period that takes us to integrate with a new feed.
Wow. So I assume that CISOs in the mobility space do use IT cybersecurity solutions, traditional solutions. Why can't they use it all over for every aspect?
We get that question a lot. So I think there's a few reasons for that. So the first is that in automotive, most of the companies out there use very proprietary protocols. You see like a BMW versus a Ford versus a Daimler. Each one of them would have different protocols. And if you run them through traditional IT security solution like a firewall or an IDS or an EDR, they would just like typically just stream them from side to side and not really do any detection. So that's one reason. The other aspect is that there is like a completely different set of contextual understanding. On the enterprise side, you have an employee logging onto their laptop, going to a VPN, some website. In here, you have a vehicle, you have drivers, the context of the vehicle, the state changes that it undergoes require a very specific domain understanding. And then you have to know what you're looking at in order to understand whether there's an anomaly or not. So that's a big difference. And we're very focused. We built a really deep contextual understanding that we call digital twin of what is that vehicle, what happens when you turn the key on and the engine starts, what happens when it's driving, what's permitted while it's driving, and then we're able to identify the anomalies based on that state. Now, our solution typically would feed an external enterprise solution like a SIM or a SOAR, where we can provide that very domain-specific understanding and enrich those products.
Okay, and you mentioned the threats, but what kind of solutions do you think that CISOs in the automotive space will adopt in 2020?
So I think the big trend that we've started to see in 2019 was a focus on security operations for connected vehicles. And that typically means that organizations are building what's called a VSOC. It's not a virtual SOC, but rather a Vehicle Security Operations Center that's looking into a real-time monitoring service that essentially looks at not at the vehicles, at the applications that connect to those vehicles, which are in our space, telematics is one application, essentially collecting telemetry from the cars and sending them commands like unlock the door remotely or turn on the engine remotely. These are types of commands. So they're looking into how to build that process and operation globally that is able to monitor these vehicles 24/7 and then create the proper playbooks and remediation activities, which are also very different than IT. Like imagine there's a big difference than if an employee laptop gets manipulated versus if a car, a braking system, or God forbid, like an engine gets manipulated remotely by a hacker. Very different outcomes, and the remediation activities have to be somewhat different as well.